welcome to episode 49 of TahrirPodcast. It is the 22nd of May 2025, and this episode is about, among many things, Egypt's new criminal procedures law, the new de facto ruling party, and a militiaman's rise. And this is the sixth episode where we break down Egyptian affairs and politics on the podcast. It started with episode 21 on the Egyptian National Dialogue in 2022, and then episode 30 on the presidential election in 2023, then episode 33 also on the election, then episode 31, and then episode 35 also on the election. And also, this is the first episode since the series on the Egyptian presidential election. So we'll try we'll attempt to cover really the most notable things that have happened since. So if you'd like to listen to commentary from later times, check them out. And joining me in this episode is Ahmed Nada, a former financial regulator and an economist. He also joined me in some of the previous episodes on Egyptian affairs. And I feel like this episode will be dense, and at the same time, Ahmed and I decided not to prepare a script for it like we didn't for the previous episodes on Egypt, because it's more natural, more transparent, and just overall better to just actually have a conversation and commentate and analyze things. Welcome, Ahmed. Welcome on the podcast.
Thank you for having me again. It's always fun to be on here with you. We do have an outline, but it's just loose bullet points. So it's better this way, I think.
Definitely. And so let's start with do you want to state the outline just briefly?
The new criminal prosecution law, well, it was new when we wrote the outline. This episode's been a few months in the making, I think. The Sinai or Arab Tribes Union, the new National Front Party, the outsourcing of repression to gangsters, public asset sales, especially to the UAE, Ahmed Tantawi's sentence almost being over, Hisham Esen's self-imposed exile, and Egypt, Trump, and Gaza.
Perfect. So let's start with the National Front Party. But before we do that, I think I need to lay the ground really needs to be laid on how it came to be. So it all started with the what we're going to refer to as the O-Man, a militiaman from Sinai who founded the Sinai Tribes Union. It fought alongside the Egyptian military in northern Sinai against to put down the IS, the Islamic State insurgency in northern Sinai. And following the defeat of IS in Sinai, they claimed to have turned in their weapons and their Humvees to the military. But there was also another militia in tandem, also led by the same guy. It's pretty easy to know who we're talking about. So in tandem and aside from the Sinai Tribes Union, there was also the Fursan al-Haytham militia, which was also in the Sinai, in northern Sinai. And this militia, also led by the same individual, the O-Man, there was really a lot of interesting things that I found, especially with the Sinai Tribes Union, which is kind of the umbrella organization under which fell Fursan al-Haytham and perhaps many others. But these are the ones that we know about for sure. And what stood out is that in one of the pictures, there were, not in many pictures really, these militiamen were wearing IDF uniforms. And there was one I was able to ID called the IDF Zahal Hermonite one-piece winter jumpsuit. And that was spotted among many of their fighters. I was able to spot that out. And they also had many Humvees, they had many PK variants, they had a lot of Chinese AKs, but I think what really stands out the most was these IDF outfits that they were wearing actively, and I think this raises many questions, but is also not surprising given that, especially during that period and when the IS insurgency was ongoing, there was a lot of cooperation with the Israelis.
And of course, you have to remember that you have to remember the place Bedouins hold in Egypt legally. They're pretty much the only people who have like an ethnic right to have weapons in Egypt. Not many people are aware of this, but Bedouins can choose whether or not they want to have Egyptian ID. And if they choose not to have Egyptian ID, they can just cross the border as long as the other country agrees to it. There's an agreement with Libya, for example, that they can just cross the border whenever, which is why there are so many Bedouin groups that were involved in arms trafficking, including the Oman. So him being able to field Chinese AKs, Humvees, and Israeli outfits isn't very difficult for him to get a hold of. They wouldn't even have to get them from the IDF themselves. Like they could just smuggle them in. Like Israel isn't exactly known for being on the up and up when it comes to its army. Their army have leaked weapons all over, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not. It's not exactly that hard to rob them either. And Bedouins can cross the border into Israel in certain places. Usually they cross it around Toba or around Rafah, though crossing Rafah nowadays is a bit harder, as you might imagine. So usually it'll be via Toba. It's not hard to get Israeli citizenship if you're a Bedouin either, because it's very hard for them to prove that you aren't a Negev Bedouin. And usually they'd rather just give you the right to permanent residency and just let you roam about. Again, you don't have to have Egyptian citizenship, but the Oman does. And you have to consider why he chose to get citizenship and why he chose to be tied down by that. Because that, I think, leads on to why he formed a political party. But we'll get to that.
Definitely. And I think now, having laid some basic ground on his rise in basically the political scene or political circles. So it started with the Sinai Tribes Union and then his other militia for San al-Haytham. And afterwards, which was also very recent, the Arab Tribes Union, which when it was emerging, it seemed like it was going to be the new de facto ruling party, only that it wasn't defined as a political party per se, but it started swallowing many other entities. It started having offices open throughout the whole country and started exporting basically this model of the Sinai Tribes Union, where you have people everywhere, you have your men here, your men there. And so it's much easier to exert your dominance and control and basically have information really about anything, anywhere, whenever. And so the experiment of the Arab Tribes Union, it was not defined as a political party. And so it was apparent that there was something that was not right. And at the same time, it was still gaining momentum. So I think what from my reading and analysis, I think this is what basically paved the way for the National Front Party. And I think the name really had a lot to do with it. You have the Arab Tribes Union. Egypt is not really that tribal. I mean, of course, there are tribes all over and so forth, but society in general is not divided really based on tribal affiliation. I mean, most people don't really know what their tribe is.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that the tribes union is specifically just for Sinai tribes, and they're very different from other Bedouin groups. I had the honor of actually talking to someone who worked with the office in charge of Bedouins affairs at the presidency before, and essentially Sinai tribes are unique in that they're settled. They're fully settled. There are almost no nomadic Bedouin tribes in Sinai. I think there's maybe 2 tribes, and they're not part of the union, as far as I'm aware. Whereas the tribes in the Western Desert and the Eastern Desert are almost all nomadic, and that makes them a little harder to pin down. Whereas when you're settled, you need infrastructure. And I think that's where all this stemmed from, that there was a need from the state to have eyes, ears, and hands helping them secure and rebuild Sinai. And people in Sinai who were already settled needed a bit more state intervention in order to get the infrastructure they needed, get the market access they needed, and actually utilize the resources they have. And some of these resources, because again, there's a lot of smuggling that goes on in Sinai. It's part of why there's a hard border between Sinai and the mainland. All that smuggling leads to an influx of hard currency. And what's the one thing Egypt has very little of in the open market? Hard currency.
And I think this takes us to the Oman's having admitted to war profiteering from the war in Gaza. And I think this is really what makes his political project and political party really a project that is steeped in Gazan blood. And even if it were not for that, I don't think it would have been something honorable. But I think this really complicates it because he admitted in an interview, I think it was the New York Times that interviewed him, in a really weird interview, I must admit. I did not like it. He admitted to having charged Gazans a lot of money to let them through. And whatever. As far as I remember, Diar Rashwan, the head of the SIS, the State Information Service, was also at the time employed by the Oman as the spokesperson of the Arab Tribes Union, denied these allegations against the Oman in an interview to the BBC, after which the Oman admitted them publicly. And I think in such a circumstance, if there was a lot of real media, the table would have shifted and he would have not gotten a chance to really rise in politics.
The main thing I'd want to add is just that the thing that makes the Oman special is that I don't think he's even one of the 50 richest people in the country. And I don't think he personally is one of the most powerful politically on his own. But that's sort of what makes him useful. In that when you want to elevate someone, when you want someone to do the dirty work, you don't want them to be independently powerful. You know, there have been a lot of people compared him to Prigozhin, but I think he's slightly more independent than Prigozhin in that he has income from his trafficking, including people. But he would contest that his trafficking of people is getting people out of a bad situation. I would contest that he's making them pay in US dollars for that. But either way, he's independently wealthy. That wealth being in hard currency makes a big difference in Egypt. But he's not on the level of someone like Abu Hanim, the guy who co-founded the Nation's Future Party that the National Front is probably going to usurp soon. So you have to wonder, why is it that someone like Abu Hanim can't stand up to someone like him? And really, it's quite simple. He doesn't have the money, but he has the backers. And we'll definitely get into why he's so heavily backed nowadays.
Definitely. And also one thing to add before we transition to the National Front Party, which is kind of the latest stage of this kind of project and the Oman's entrance into politics, even though as a shadow man, but still. So when the Arab Tribes Union was announced, which is, as I stated briefly before, was a merger of the Sinai Tribes Union and many, quote, unions all over the country. So once that was announced, and they announced it was going to be all over, more than 200 MPs rushed to apply without even knowing what was going on. So I thought that was quite signaling and was quite reflective, really, of what was to come. And when I noticed that, and many things, I was almost quite certain that something political was going to come out of it. There was a political party that was somehow going to be founded, because it was pretty apparent that there were many a green light that were given. And this export seems to have been quite successful, or maybe not successful, maybe invasive, or I can't find the right word for it. But the culmination of these efforts that have failed with the Arab Tribes Union have succeeded with the National Front Party, which has now swallowed much of the incumbent de facto ruling party, Mustaqbal Watan, Future of a Nation, or Nation's Future Party. So I'm curious to hear what you think about that in particular.
So the Nation's Future Party, a lot of people thought that the National Front came out of nowhere, but it actually makes sense as to why it came out when it did, because it came out just after the Nation's Future Party failed to assert itself in Parliament again. So they're the de facto ruling party, but they don't actually have enough votes to pass any legislation on their own. I think Don't quote me on the numbers, but I think they have 316 seats, but they need 398. But usually they were able to form a coalition with independents and with smaller parties, usually by throwing them a bone. This is where you get stuff like a hospital being opened in the middle of nowhere because the MP from that area of the middle of nowhere requested that specifically, so he would vote on everything afterwards. Or where you get like 3 highways being built in the same village, and then everywhere else in the same government is begging for one bridge, that kind of thing. This isn't really unique to Egypt, like pork barreling like this is a global phenomenon, but what is unique to the Nation's Future Party is that as a party, it has always hated itself. So we've mentioned the Nation's Future Party in previous episodes, but for like a really quick and dirty rundown, what happened was there was the Social Democratic Party. They were based out of Cairo, but had major offices in the south because the south was one of their more or less heartlands when it came to organizing. Because a lot of unions in the south, especially the Farmers Syndicate, are very into the idea of not left politics, but left of center, or at least the idea of left of center in concept. The Social Democratic Party then splintered, and the southern portion of it became the Nation's Future Party, led by Ashraf Rashad, who was the guy leading the INA branch of the Social Democratic Party. Now, this guy was known to be an opportunist. Like, the main thing that people know about him was that he was an opportunist who would do anything for power. So put him on one side. Then you had the Free Egyptians Party, who were founded by Naguib Sawiris to be Egypt's neoliberal party. And they actually got the most seats in the 2015 election. They got 65 out of 596. Now, if you're thinking that doesn't sound like a lot, yeah, the elections at the time had 2/3 independents. Among those 2/3 independents were people who then moved to the Nation's Future Party once they got a new backer, Mohammed Abu Lainain, the guy who owns Ceramica Cleopatra. Now, why did he join? He joined because he wanted to be involved with a party and wanted to be the vice president of a party, but didn't want to lead it himself. He didn't want the notoriety of it. He essentially wanted the position of influence without having to wield the power that comes with it or having to deal with the politicking that comes with it. But he brought money. Now, this guy is like a billionaire in USD terms. He's the real deal. What he doesn't bring is direction. So what they did is after the Free Egyptians crashed out really hard in 2017 because all of their efforts of trying to form a bill to create austerity in the country long term with the help of the IMF failed miserably. So a bunch of the Free Egyptians left and moved to join the Nation's Future Party. This gets complicated because in Egypt, you can't change your parliamentary affiliation mid-parliament. So what it looked like on paper was that the Nation's Future Party, which at the time was, I think, the third or fourth largest party in parliament, suddenly became the one with the most MPs. But on paper, it wasn't. Anyway, so people from the Free Egyptians Party, like Tahrir Radwan, who led several parliamentary committees throughout the years, who became one of their lead strategists, joined the party. They also got people who were not part of the Free Egyptians, but in their sphere, like TV personality and journalist Yusuf al-Husseini, who then became the spokesman for the party. But all these people are ideologically incoherent. They're incongruent with each other. They then got an influx of people from the army, most notably people from the army who had participated in the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. They then got an influx of people who were judges at the time, people like Abdul Wahab Abdelrazak, who became the head of the Senate. Again, all these people completely politically incongruent with each other. They all had different aims and they all want absolute power for themselves. But the one who kept things ticking was Ashraf Rashad, keeping the parliamentary wing of the party moving. He was the majority leader for almost the entire time, from 2017 to 2024. And that's when things changed. Because he got ousted. It was very messy. He didn't appear in Parliament when they were announcing that he was ousted. They announced that someone was leading it. I think it was Qassabi or Qassabi, and he denied that he was leading the party, that he was the new majority leader, and then it was given to one of the generals, who then denied that he was being given the post as well, and then it went back to another guy who also denied that he was leading the post. And by the time they actually settled on a majority leader, it didn't really matter who they settled on. It was someone who didn't have the influence to actually whip votes together and didn't have the cachet that Ashraf Rashad had, because at that point he'd had almost a decade of experience leading a party, like the better part of a decade leading a party and getting these deals done. He knew the people, he knew how to get things done, and he knew just what it took to get people to agree to form a coalition with the Nation's Future Party. So why was he ousted? I couldn't tell you, but it was a long time coming, given that the party was always incoherent, was always very incongruous. All these people had diverging opinions on everything. It's part of why Parliament was so slow to get any major legislation done. And it's part of why coalitions are so easy to come by, because you could always find at least one MP from the nation's future party who agreed with whatever minor party was coming in or with whatever independent was coming in. But it was always fragile. With the National Front, you can see that they have more of a unified vision of what they want it to be. They haven't articulated that vision, but the formal leaders of the party, Diot Rochon, the president's right-hand man, the guy who led the national dialogue, he's very wedded to the idea of the new republic, whatever that means. It's still not clear what that means. Then you had, I forgot his name, but the guy who was the Minister of Housing under Madbouli, who was a personal friend of Madbouli, by the way. Like, they went to uni together. Um, he was the formal person who incorporated the party, who registered it. He is extremely wedded to the idea of the new republic. But again, what does it mean? And then you have Vergeni, the O-man, who, to say he's wedded to the new republic is misleading, because I don't think he's wedded to any particular thing ideologically, other than just him getting more money and more influence. He's very well connected now, but that came from above. He wouldn't have been able to start a party on his own, and I think it's very telling that he's not formally part of the party. He's just in the background. So he's sort of the Abu Hanain of this situation, where he doesn't want the spotlight, but he wants the influence. The big question mark I would have over the party, given the MPs that switched over, is when not all of the NFP MPs moved over to the new NFP, and I hate that they have the same acronym, when not all of them moved over, and especially people like Ashraf Rashad didn't move over, at least as far as I'm aware so far, are they going to actually be a party that works? Because it's one thing getting a lot of seats. It's a whole other thing actually passing things. And for the image of the New Republic to work, and for the government to function on paper, you need to have legislation passing. The past year or so of not having any major legislation go through without it being an agonizing journey through multiple committees that all hate each other, that's not something that can continue. And I think it's very telling that the elections haven't been announced as of yet, as far as I've seen. They're supposed to happen this year. They're supposed to happen, I think, by August. It was either August or October. I can't quite remember. And they still haven't been announced. So there's going to be a lot of prep going on once they are announced, and I think that chaos. I'm not sure if the National Front is ready for that yet. One thing they could do, they could spend the next parliament in the shadows. That's something that the Egypt October Party did. It backfired for them. It backfired really hard for them, because they went from being very relevant, having that Wunderkind as the head of the party, to kicking him out and becoming completely irrelevant within a week. But if they wanted to spend the next parliament outside of parliament, they could. They could even try to advance the whole idea of the New Republic by allowing other parties to take prominence, knowing that no party will actually reach a threshold big enough to form their own coalition, or knowing that the coalitions they would form would be very fragile. Or they could form the first shadow cabinet, since that's been proposed at least a dozen times in the past 2 years, of having a shadow government of some form, even an extra parliamentary shadow government, as a way of controlling the narrative. And I think that that's the whole purpose of a shadow government, which is controlling the opposition narrative, making sure that you lead the charge against the government, rather than it coming from elsewhere.
But I think before we get into other topics, I think my main disagreement with you is that you're assuming that there is real parliamentary politics. You're not really acknowledging that it is ultimately a rubber stamp parliament. It's not. I didn't think.
Oh no, there is real politics, because if you didn't think there were, they wouldn't have built all those useless bridges, or paved roads that no one uses, or built hospitals in the middle of nowhere. There is a process that goes on. The thing is, the outcome is predetermined. Getting to that outcome, that takes effort.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Because if you think about many things, including the new criminal procedure law, which we're going to discuss at length in this episode, this is something, there is no justification really for it, except someone from security, put it together, and then force them basically to approve it. I think this
You can see with laws like that, you can always see the compromises that happened along the way. And you can also see the odd timing where other bills pass alongside it, or even part of an omnibus to get people on board with it. So one of the when we get onto it, one of the compromises in that criminal prosecution bill is that they finally put a limit on pretrial detention, like a time limit. That's something the state hasn't wanted for a while. Like that's something that's going to take the state a while to recuperate.
but
But
I think let me just reply this part briefly. I think it's just optics. They said it that so constitutionally it was 2 years. That was the pretrial detention term. Now they said it's gonna be a year and a half. But realistically, there are people that have been in pretrial detention for 4 years and 5 years. So
well, actually, there's a fact check on that. The Constitution doesn't actually say how long it is. It just leaves it up to the law. But there wasn't actually a law in place. But now there is. The question is whether it will be applied retroactively. Because if it's not applied retroactively, then anyone who's already been in pretrial detention for years, they're shit out of luck.
But there was a law specifically stating that the maximum term for, I think that was maybe the criminal procedure law. It was stating that it was 2 years, the maximum pretrial detention. I'm 100% sure of that number.
Yeah, though that was easier to skirt, mainly because the law back then was, I think it was a pre-revolution era law. So most of those laws more or less don't exist. Like they exist on paper, but most of them haven't been applied. It's sort of like how the law on probation has existed since I think 2003 or 2002, but hasn't been applied at all. But now there's a new law on probation. Now they're starting to apply that. It's almost like any law that was passed under the NDP just doesn't exist.
But this is also, I know, this is like arguing that it's almost in the same basket of like freedom of speech articles in the Constitution. I mean, the Constitution does guarantee a lot of freedoms, but ultimately this doesn't get applied. So they both fall under the same category. It's stuff that's already there, but it's not taken seriously.
It always depends, because with any law in any country, the law is useless unless applied. And it's only applied if there's pressure to apply it. So with something like the probation, right? You don't need much pressure to get the government to put you on probation instead of putting you in prison, because that's usually easier for them. It's easier to guarantee someone doesn't leave the country than to actually put someone in prison. It's better for their optics as well. But if you're someone that they choose to actually arrest, then pressuring them to let you out after a couple of years, after a year and a half, that's a lot harder. Because if they've gone far enough to say that, no, you're not going to just be under house arrest, we're actually going to arrest you, then you're already far enough gone that they're probably not going to let you go. It's similar with, say, the way Trump has been treating Middle Eastern students, right? Legally, they have a right to due process, except who's going to stand up for you? Which lawyer is going to take your case? Who's going to agree that your case is valid in the first place? Who's going to give you standing when your visa's already been revoked, even though the revocation could be illegal? Doesn't matter. As long as the law isn't being pressured to be applied, then it doesn't exist.
Okay, so now that we've delved into the criminal procedure law, I think this is one that should be really looked at in detail, because I think it's extremely problematic on every level. It exacerbates warrantless searches, privacy violations, reduced role for lawyers, remote legal proceedings. This is what already happens, but this makes it legal. And restrictions on reporting on trials, expanding persecution powers, travel bans, making travel bans be under the Prosecutor General. So overall, it is extremely problematic on every level and in every sense, really. But there has been a lot of doublespeak regarding how it's spoken about in the media and also in Parliament, and also internationally, how they're trying to sell it as something that is positive, when in reality it's the absolute complete opposite of that. So what's your take on that? And also, before we delve into that more, the criminal procedure law is almost like a second constitution, really, in terms of its importance. So I'm curious to hear your take on that.
So to understand the criminal procedure law, you can't understand it as a bill that came out of nowhere or as a bill specifically to create a new criminal procedure. You have to understand it in the context of them trying to unify laws. So like the unified tax law or the unified insurance law. They've been trying to since 2015, though more effectively since 2018. They've been trying to unify a bunch of old laws into one and then amend them along the way as part of that. You've seen this happen in other countries like Indonesia, where instead of amending one law, then another, they'll do an omnibus where they amend a bunch of things at once. And as part of doing that, which they did in this case as well, they'll throw you a few bones. They'll make a few compromises. So it's not entirely a negative. But the biggest negative, in my opinion, is the lost opportunity. Like this unified criminal laws dating back to 1875, it took away the 1951 Penal Code, which was very problematic. Like if you think our criminal law right now is bad, you should read the 1951 law that we were using this whole time, because that was atrocious. Stuff like I did research on when they were arresting the those girls for TikTok, for just posting on TikTok. That was all based on one line from the 1951 law that doesn't exist anymore. That, in my opinion, didn't even justify arresting them, but it was just a line saying that you can't breach family values. That's gone. So that's one positive of very few. The biggest negative, in my opinion, is just the missed opportunity to fix the legal code, to remove all the abysmal stuff that was in there from 1875 onwards. But most of it was just a renewal and rewording of the same stuff that already existed. And a lot of the things that people are incensed by is just adding another line, just adding more exposition to something that already existed, like you said, like things that already occurred. The biggest missed opportunity for me was pretrial detention, because that was the headline part of it, that now you could receive financial compensation if you win your case, that now it's limited to 1.5 years, though obviously it's not retroactive, that now probation is an option, though it was before, they just didn't take it. And most notably that now there's an actual framework for how journalists are meant to be in courts, which according to the law, the prevailing attitude is just don't be. But if you are, then there's a lot of muzzling going on, that they have to be there. Essentially, it's very similar to American federal court now, in terms of journalists can only be there to be seen but not heard. They can't take pictures, they can't take recordings, they can report on what's going on, but they can't say anything that goes against what the court stenographer says, which honestly, they might as well not be there. I say this is my opinion for both countries, like they honestly might as well not be there, given the limitations on them. Whereas before it was more or less the Wild West. Like as long as the judge was okay with it, you could do whatever you wanted. There were cases of journalists in Egyptian courts like heckling people. There were even cases where they would take pictures of defendants whose identities were not made public yet. Stuff like that. That's all gone now. Now you could frame this as a win for innocent until proven guilty, but that's not really. I don't think it's worth all that. Like, it's similar to if someone said that you could no longer take pictures in public and you frame this as a win for privacy. Like, sure, yeah, if you want absolute privacy, go ahead. But I don't think it's worth the cost. And I think the cost is that journalists more or less can't enter courtrooms anymore. And if they do, they can't really say anything novel that wasn't already in the court documents. They can still congregate outside, but they can't really affect the proceedings anyway. They can't block proceedings anyway. One of the biggest changes that no one really talked about is that now you can criminalize the act of striking without permission. So the lawyers right now are on strike. They're on a 2-day strike. And they had to approve the 2-day strike from within their syndicate. They didn't have to do that before, because now a wildcat strike is considered a crime. Before it wasn't. Now this was a crime in the 1875 Penal Code. This was also a crime in the 1951 Penal Code, but this was amended away in 1953. Now it's back. And you can see a lot of that in how it was worded. Honestly, the criminal procedure code, if you told me it was ghostwritten by the IMF, like they wrote maybe half of it, I would believe you. Because a lot of it is more or less moving Egypt in line with other countries that the IMF has a large involvement with, like Pakistan, like Argentina, like Indonesia. a lot of it is moving in line with what an emerging market that wants to enter the capitalist realm properly should have in terms of penal code. And that's where I think a lot of the foreign media fawning over it is coming from. Um, there are some decent parts to it, but every time I try to defend it in my head, I think, well, if you really wanted to make it good, you had the opportunity to, and you've missed that opportunity willingly. So you could more or less remix the existing code and add a few more powers to the police in between. Um, a lot of the powers the police gained were ones that they lost in the previous bill that regulated police. So this might have been the other shoe to drop. Because obviously, how do they get the police to agree to things like the police being able to be sued? Well, by giving them more powers to search and seize. That's one way to do it.
And now that we've spoken about lawyers, in the new criminal procedure law, the lawyers face more restrictions, where you find now prosecutors can now control access to files. They can limit the lawyer's participation in investigations and interrogations, and also generally is also unprecedented, really. And also, it's worthy to mention now that we've spoken about that, is that in political cases, meaning the state security court, normally lawyers don't even see the court documents in which they're standing trial for. So this almost enshrines it in law that lawyers be prevented from accessing case files, which, is quite wild, really, to just even think about.
And to add to your point, because they abolished state security courts, except for currently outstanding cases, this is one way of stealthily bringing them back. Not in terms of procedure, but in terms of outcome.
But
Um,
but just before we jump on something else, I don't think this is true, because people are still being rounded up, and there are still cases being started in 2025. So the argument that the state security court is no longer standing, I don't think it is. I don't think it's true. New
no,
cases are still
like
being.
on paper, it's supposed to be finishing up its docket, but the docket is still expanding. A lot of that is being done more or less by going around it, by adding people to existing cases. Though there are new cases being made, even though they shouldn't be. But the point is, like, if you want to get rid of state security court, like long term, you need to give the state a way to continue doing what it's doing. So one easy way of doing that is by essentially limiting lawyers' ability for discovery, even discovering the fact of their own case. It's also worth noting that, like, a lot of things in this code that already happened. It was just that sometimes lawyers would argue that this is contempt of court, or would argue that this would lead to a mistrial, and that would make trials extend longer and longer, which is something the state doesn't want, because they don't want cases going on for years anymore. It's embarrassing. It takes too long. And now it might even accrue fees if someone manages to sue the state for fees for detention. I don't think anyone will actually ever claim that money, but, or will successfully claim that money at least. But it's still a headache to deal with. So any way to make it so that defense lawyers specifically, can't contest cases as well is welcome for the state.
And now the remote legal proceedings, which is you basically are tried via Zoom, so you don't actually have to go to court. I think this is really one of the wildest part about it. The most Orwellian.
I actually think that the online trial part is one of the most defensible, mainly because that was already happening. And it was actually going kind of well. There were a bunch of prisons, some of the newer prisons had the ability to attend court via Zoom, more or less, which was a lot better than the way they used to attend it, which is that they would get stuffed into a police car, or one of those police vans, taken to a court, so the judge can say, "Oh, sorry, we've delayed the case," and then send them back to the prison. Which, if you were in a prison like Wadi Matrun or Badr, that could take hours out of your life. It could even take 5 to 6 hours just going there and back. And also, a lot of countries have been adding the ability to be to prosecute your case online. It adds to the ability to record it, adds to the ability to have posterity for what goes on in a case. The downside is that they didn't take this to its logical conclusion of you don't have to imprison people pre-trial if you can just do it over Zoom.
Yeah, and also, I mean, if you think about it realistically, I mean, if any of us was a political prisoner and you had a chance really to at least go to court and see or judge and see people, I think that would make a huge difference to just going to some room where you're held and you just face a camera that might not actually be on. I think this opens the door really to a lot of violations. You cannot speak honestly, and I think this itself is enough reason that this sort of change should not have taken place. I think it is extremely cruel.
For political cases, yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking of just for the majority of people, like the vast majority of cases, it's just going to save you the hassle of going to court. There is one thing protecting against the camera not being on or it just being a fake proceeding, and that it has to proceed with your lawyer. Like your lawyer has to be in the online meeting, and the judge has to be there. But this makes it easier for judges as well to get around cases by lowering the barrier to just delaying a case over and over. If you've ever actually had a legal case in Egypt, and I've had a few go through, you know how often you get called to the courtroom just so the judge can say it's been postponed.
So before we move on to the other topics of today, there's the really interesting issue that just recently popped up on my feed, and that is the outsourcing of repression to gangsters. And I'm not really exaggerating. This actually did happen, and apparently is taking form. It is unprecedented. And in episode 31, I actually reflect on that when I attended the rally. That's when there was 2023 when the field marshal, the incumbent president, announced he would run for a third term, and they had celebrations and so forth on every square almost. And so what I noticed differently, that was done differently, is that it was not exclusively police that was protecting it. It was these thugs, people from private security companies. And so this, in a sense, is not new, relegating some security to these people and entities, but to relegate repressive assignments to these gangsters, I think is really unprecedented. And how I found out about that, it was yesterday. There was a video of one of these thugs saying that he collaborated with security, with the Ministry of Interior, to arrest a traitor that was tweeting on Twitter stuff against the Egyptian government, and he said his username and his name, and said he was being funded by someone from, I don't know, somewhere coastal, which is completely made up, and also really absurd and funny at the same time, because the guy he said he arrested with the police actually was the one who tweeted the video and told him, no, that's not my name, and I was not arrested. So I think it is quite funny, but ultimately it is quite, I think, very alarming, extremely alarming. I sound like Trump.
Well, it is just distressing to see. It's not new, to be clear. Like if you remember under Mubarak, there was Sabri Nakhnouch and people like him. The state often likes to, and I say the state in general, not just in Egypt, the state likes to outsource violence because it's easier to pretend not to notice. It's also easier to police. So remember how I mentioned like the Oman, the thing that makes him so useful is that he doesn't have his own independent power base specifically. With gangsters, you always have the ability to arrest them if they go out of line. That's something like, for example, it's well documented that during the Reconstruction, that the U.S. wouldn't send police against black people. They wouldn't send police against striking unions. They would send the Pinkertons, who were essentially a professional gang. Nowadays, they're a security firm, And you see this gang into security firm thing happening in Egypt as well, because Sabri Nakhnouk's gang became Falcon Security. The Oman's gang became, I think, 3 different security companies that operate in Sinai. Mercenaries that used to work for like Bush and Halliburton became G4S, became Academy or Blackwater or whatever their name is now. This happens a lot because they're very useful for a state. It's very useful to have a militia that you can call on, that you can just sick on people and then say, oh my, I can't believe that happened. Anyway, but the difference now is that the frequency is rising. And I think that this leads to an overarching theme that since 2022, 23-ish, this state has been a lot more fragile and has been lashing out. I'm a broken record because I bring this up a lot. A strong state isn't one that oppresses you directly. It's one that gets you to be your own oppressor because you're afraid of the state. I've moved to the UK recently, just this year. And I can tell you that the UK has a very strong state compared to Egypt. Because if a British person just litters on the ground, they know that a camera's already caught them, 3 officers have been dispatched, and they're not going to get a fair trial. Because it's actually enshrined in their legal code that there is such a thing as a thought crime of thinking of impeding the public. That was added in 2022. But even beyond that, they know that if they resist arrest, that in itself is a crime. If they talk back to the cop, that's a crime. So your easiest option is to just go with the flow, contest it in court, take your fine and go. That's what a strong state does. It gets you to be compliant. If you want to the opposite side of the spectrum, a very weak state is one where the police are all holding AK-47s and they have APCs in front of every building. You can remember that from just after the revolution, even up until 2016, 2017, when there were still bombings going on. You saw the state was afraid. There were APCs in front of police precincts. There were sandbags in front of police precinct windows. My nearest precinct had 2 APCs parked in front, had a fucking Browning machine gun on the roof, and had sandbags all over the windows. Now it's just one of those like metallic sheen things with not even, it just has one security camera and one very tired security guard out front. That's the state getting more complacent and getting more confident in its position. When it goes back to its old things, when it goes back to militarization, when it goes back to using thugs instead of the police, it's insecure. It feels like something is going wrong, and it is. So at least they have eyes and ears.
I agree. But also this guy in particular, the one I was just speaking about, the one who made this video and posted it on Twitter, the thug, as a state or as a statesman, running things, you, at least, I don't know, because this guy, he was arrested 8 months ago because he was attending a funeral. And you know how funerals, if you're like a celebrity or something in Egypt, it's bombarded with journalists that are just filming because that's the only thing they can do, basically. I don't think they qualify as journalists, but that's how they're addressed. So anyway, he was attending a attending a funeral, and a journalist was filming him. And so he told her to stop filming him. She didn't comply. So he threatened to beat her and have his men, quote, his men, take her out to the desert and kill and bury her. She still refused and told him she'll make a police complaint against him. So he beat her up. He physically assaulted her there at the funeral and told her, I will not be imprisoned for a day over you. And that did happen. He's a free man now, and he's helping the state round up, quote, traitors. So I think this is really what you were describing was something problematic, but I think this is even more problematic when you have these sorts of people doing all these sorts of things and not being held accountable for it and basically wreaking havoc through society. And I'm just talking about this one particular behavioral incident, but these people are not only selling their arms and might, they're also selling product. They're selling drugs. They're selling hard drugs. They're selling cocaine. They're selling
and more than anything, they're selling fear, right? And I think personally, I'm less afraid of a guy like him than I am the Oman, because a guy like him doesn't know how to be subtle. Like if the government wants to make a show of, oh, we're going after the gangs again, the mafia is going to get hammered like it did back in 2015 and 2016. He's going first. Like you know he's marked for death. Well, not death specifically, but you know what I mean. Like he's marked for just you're getting a 5,000 year sentence. You're going behind the sun. So guy like him, he's not long for this world. But someone like the O-Man, where it's not he's not a thug in image and aesthetic, right? He doesn't have the aesthetic of I'm going to bury you in the desert. He has the aesthetic of you're going to regret that. And it's that threat through subtext that's scarier. And well, I make this joke a lot, but you know, Egyptians want to be more like a first world country. That's what first world repression looks like. Someone like the O-Man telling you, "Oh, I can get you to really regret everything you're doing completely legally." And also, instead of having a militia, he has a security company. Actually, 3 security companies, which I don't know why anyone would need 3 security companies, but I guess, you know, more government contracts. The fun thing as well is that a lot of these aren't government contracts at all because they don't want to be traced back to the government. And that's another sign of vulnerability, right? Because a state that feels secure in itself doesn't hide what it's doing. Doesn't hide anything that it's doing with these kinds of things. It just trust that journalists won't care, and if they see it, even if they seek it out, no one will care if they talk about it. But they're worried, very worried, and I think they're right to be worried because fundamentally, the thing that makes the state the least secure as any point that it can be is when people are less comfortable. Because fundamentally, the big thing that leads to protest, the thing that leads to like meaningful protest, million-person marches, riots, is when people don't have anything left to lose. You saw that with Occupy a few years later. You saw that with the Arab Spring. You saw that again in 2013 against Morsi. You saw that again in 2017 when there were protests and that people have memory hold and just forgot never happened. And those protests led to Sharif Ismail getting kicked upstairs into being a presidential advisor instead of being prime minister. You saw that again with the protests that happened in Syria in 2011, 2010. You saw that with the protests that happened in Iraq basically every year I've been alive. When people don't have anything left to lose, that's when they take to the streets. Look at something like the London riots, right? People who were rioting in 2010 and 2011 weren't the people who had mortgages. They weren't the people who had student loan debt. They were the people who couldn't get into uni, who couldn't get a job, who couldn't get ahead in life. And I thought, well, if I'm going down and taking the state down with me, if I'm going down, I'm at least going to rob a store first, right? You don't want to let people reach that point, especially if it reaches a point that's as strong as what happened in 1977, where people had so little left to lose and were on the verge of going hungry. So they decided to set the whole country on fire. And if you want to see a state more repressive than the state that exists now, more effective at being repressive than the state that exists now, look at how the state under Sadat behaved before 1977 and after, because that scared the hell out of them. And if something similar happens now, it will scare the hell out of the current government, but more importantly, what didn't exist back then, it will scare the hell out of the people who own the debt. Because the external debt, that's not owned by Egyptians. That is owned by people who have no stake in the country whatsoever, who at the first sign of instability will run. And that's what I think is scaring the state so much. It's what's forcing it to try to make a few token reforms, what's scaring it into outsourcing violence to gangs and making the police a bit less militarized. It's what's scaring them into trying at least somewhat to alleviate some burdens off the poorest people so that they at least have something left to lose. But I don't know how long they can continue this tightrope act.
And this takes us to public asset sales. They recently sold the Bank de Caire, the Bank Qahira, Cairo Bank to the UAE for $1 billion. So what do you think about that?
I'm honestly shocked they got $1 billion for it. They've been trying to sell it for, I think the first time they mentioned it was like 2014 that they've been trying to sell it. Because honestly, I don't know a single person who uses Bank to Care. I think I've seen maybe 3 branches of Bank to Care in my life. It's very much the state's red-headed stepchild when it comes to state banks, but it follows with a common theme of them trying to sell assets rather than rehabilitate them. Or in the case of Sipes, the one that pisses me off the most, rehabilitating an asset and then selling it. But fundamentally, what they need is dollars. They need dollars now in the bank, now. And it doesn't matter what they have to sell in order to get it. It does say a lot, though, that they're not selling their big assets. They're not selling shares in the National Bank. They're not selling shares of Banco Mosr. They're selling shares in companies that they don't give a crap about. What scares me more is that now they're talking about selling Waltania Petroleum, selling Silo Foods, which, for those who aren't aware what Silo Foods is, Silo Foods was a company set up by the National Service Products Organization, the Army, more or less, in order to do all the student meals, because the private companies they had doing student meals gave them a few ones that were spoiled. Silo Foods student meals contract, that's worth several tens of billions of Egyptian pounds every single year. And the amount will only go up, both with inflation and because the amount of students is still going up. It's probably going to level off in a few years, but it's still going up for now. Just selling that, privatizing school meals, that will be huge. The quality will go down even further, and the quality isn't extremely high to begin with. It's extremely mediocre. And you're selling a huge source of rent income, because Silo Foods doesn't really need any investment. Like it owns the farms that it gets the food from. It owns the processing plants, and it owns the trucks. So all logistics is handled in-house. Everything's handled in-house because that's how the army works. So you'd be buying all of that straight up. With Wataniya is very important. Not just because it's an army petroleum company. It actually doesn't have that many gas stations. It doesn't have that many oil fields. But what it does have is that it's one of only 2 state companies with EGAS. One of only 2 that actually has the capacity to explore for more oil. And this is why, for example, when you look at oil deals in Egypt, like the deal with Eni gives Eni about a third of the profits, the one for the Zorka gas field. The deal with Dana Gas gives them 35, I think, % of the profits. And the one with Apache in the Western Desert gives them 40%. Whereas when you look at, say, BP's deal with Qatar only gets 20%. The Saudis have the best deal in the Gulf, and they only get 40% of the income that Aramco makes. The rest goes to Chevron and I can't remember the other. I think it was Chevron and ExxonMobil. The reason for this is because those countries don't have the ability to explore for their own oil, but Egypt does, and so does Algeria. That's why Algeria also has decent contracts. Same with Russia, same with Guyana. If you know how to explore, then you can negotiate a better deal. Wataniya is the only one that knows how to explore for petroleum specifically, whereas EGAS is the one that explores for gas. So if they sell that part of it as part of the stake, or as part of the whole full sale, that's catastrophic. That's taking away state capacity, like a very important state capacity as well. And no one in the media is going to mention this, because I guarantee most of them don't know about it. They just see it as another asset sale. Selling Bank 2K is one thing, right? Selling the 7th most important state bank. Selling Wataniya Petroleum is a lot more important. Selling Salfi Water isn't just a water bottling company. It's not just the most mid water you've ever tasted. It has wells that it owns in Siwa. It owns the wells, like water like Haya. There's another one, Barca. Both of those, Haya being owned by Mansour and Barca being owned by Nestle, those use wells in Al Ubayya and wells in Siwa. And the wells in Siwa that they own are leased from Salfi. That's why Salfi's water is worse than them, because they give them the wells, turn a profit. It also has a bottling plant. The only bottling plant in Siwa, as far as I'm aware, is owned by Salfi. That's huge. Like, these are actual assets being sold. They haven't been sold yet, last I heard. They might have been. I haven't checked in a bit on the asset sales. But more and more things are being sold, and more red lines are being crossed. Because in the beginning, if you remember in, I think, 2018-ish, when they announced the asset sale program, they said they wouldn't sell controlling stakes, and they wouldn't sell companies that make USD, and they wouldn't sell companies that have a large presence abroad, and most importantly, they wouldn't sell strategic companies. All of those red lines have been crossed. They sold 100% of Sipes, and they sold 100% of Bank Duquesne, or more or less all of their stake. They sold their entire stake in the in Eastern Company, or saw half of the stake in Eastern Company, but that gave effective control away. An Eastern Company makes money in USD, not just in EGP. And they sold or are planning to sell, like I said, Wataniya, which is strategically important, Salfi strategically important. Just the level of desperation is reminding me a lot of the 2010s UK when they sold, or sorry, the 90s UK and 80s UK when they sold British Petroleum. Like it's the kind of sale that tells you a lot about where the government is heading and how desperate they are to get money.
And now that you've mentioned these decisions being not the most strategic, I think there's a pattern really that could be seen here on many a field. Let's talk about Egyptian-Israeli relations, for example. So we import gas from Israel, the same gas that we then use to power our electricity stations. So you do that, and afterwards you try to negotiate with the Israelis, between the Israelis and the Palestinians, with Hamas and Israel. And then after that, when they breached the Philadelphia Corridor and all of that, you try to negotiate with the Israelis directly for yourself. And so zoom out, and you're negotiating with an entity that basically really holds you by the neck, really. And it's not that they haven't played that card before. They have. And we had a power outage for, I think, a day or something like that in tandem with the negotiations. So the current government really is not very keen on being strategic. I wouldn't really take lessons on strategy from either of them.
Yeah, and it's worth noting when you negotiate with Israel, you're negotiating with Israel and the looming America above both of you. People like to talk about the arms deal, the $2 or $3 billion of aid, but that you can only spend that on American military equipment anyway. Like it's less aid and more just a coupon. It's a gift card. What matters more is the US dollar because Egypt has a trade deficit. Egypt has a capital deficit. Egypt has a current account deficit. It has a deficit of everything related to do with the US dollar. That is where Israel comes in. Because, for example, when Trump issued his tariffs, one of the first things he did was tell Egypt that even though their tariff is 10%, the lowest one available at least, unless you're Russia, that they could get even lower if they make more things with Israel as part of the Qualified Industrial Zones QIZ program. Another thing is, so Egypt does import gas from Israel. The reason they do that is because it's cheaper, because Israel doesn't refine its own gas, but Egypt refines its own gas. So Egypt exports its refined gas and imports more or less crude gas from Israel. It does the same with the Gulf, where it imports from the Gulf and Iraq crude oil that it refines in Egypt and then it exports Egyptian refined oil. This makes sense until you don't have the ability to do this anymore. Like the problem with Israel cutting off the gas supply isn't that Egypt doesn't have enough gas. It's that if Egypt uses its own gas instead of exporting it, that's dollars being set on fire. And they can't have that because they don't have enough dollars for anything, let alone dollars to set on fire for political reasons. So when they're negotiating, when you see stuff like the Philadelphia Corridor or with any of the ceasefires, who are the two guarantors? It's Egypt and Qatar. So the country that has a huge US dollar deficit and the country where like a tenth of the country is a US military base. Like they're not exactly independent arbiters.
And now that we've spoken about public asset sales, I think we need to address specific sales to the Emiratis and to the Saudis. So I'm curious to hear your take on this.
So honestly, I don't discriminate between who's buying the assets because, in my opinion, as long as it's a foreign asset buyer, it's going to be more or less the same. Sometimes the media tries to frame it as, oh, we're selling to our brethren, but I don't trust them as far as I can throw them. At the end of the day, even though the Emiratis have stood by Egypt before, like during the revolution, I don't think they did that for free. They got a lot out of it. And at the very least, they get something out of it in that Egypt stays there to defend them against Iran, to defend them against each other, to defend them against Israel if things get too tense, at least in theory. It's there to prevent Turkey from exerting too much influence, to prevent Russia from exerting too much influence. Like they more or less treat Egypt like a mall cop that they sometimes give tips to.
So you don't see a competition between the Saudis and the Emiratis in Egypt?
I don't think they're competing on that much, more just who can monopolize more assets. They both have the same goal, I think, in that they want to have more control over Egypt politically, but more importantly, like more important than Egypt politically, and even more important than Egypt's army, is they don't have very active economies. Like when you look at the UAE and Saudi, their service economies, their goods economies, they're not very active. The Saudi economy has been getting glazed all over the place for becoming a whole 10% of GDP. Like genuinely, there's just not much going on. Whereas in Egypt, Egypt has an extremely vibrant economy. It's just missing dollars. And when you come in with dollars, your purchasing power is amplified. Now, it's not as much as before 2022 and 2023, because in that financial year, when the huge devaluation happened and all that inflation happened, before that, a dollar was worth at least $5 in Egypt in terms of purchasing power, like raw purchasing power just based on prices. But now it's still at least double the power based on the influence it gives you and the access it gives you and how much you can actually purchase for it. But you see them trying to convert their dollars into Egyptian pounds and work with those because they don't want to be price gouged, because they want to have as many assets as they can with as little upkeep as they can. They're rentier at the end of the day. And I don't think that they really see a distinction between buying a hospital in Cairo and buying a hospital in London. The core goal is the same. You're just rent seeking.
I can really see that. And now this takes us to the former presidential hopeful, politician Ahmed Tantawi. His sentence is almost over now. I think 5 or 6 days away from the end of his sentence. But interestingly, today, actually, and almost 2 hours ago, his wife, journalist Rasha Andil, was summoned to the State Security Court. So it does not really look good for him and his immediate family. I don't think he will be a free man next week. What do you think?
I don't think he's going free either, but honestly, I think even if he is nominally free, I don't think he's going to be meaningfully free again in his life. Um, I think I don't know him personally, but I think if you gave him the option of undoing everything that led to this point, I think he'd probably take it, given that he didn't really gain that much from it. I don't think he can do it again. Um, Even like beyond the restrictions on him doing it again, I don't think he has the energy to do it again. Once you go through something like that, having the entire state apparatus go against you for the crime of maybe becoming the third most voted for candidate if you were able to run, that really breaks you. Like that breaks something inside you. I think his best option, if he can take it, is self-imposed exile abroad like he was before. But beyond that, I think his political project is over.
And now this takes us to Hisham Asim, who chose self-imposed exile, now that you've just mentioned it. I think he's back in the US now. And his case was really particularly interesting, especially with the timing. So right before, a little bit before, the EU approved a loan to Egypt. And in the assessment, which was heavily reported on, they mentioned that they witnessed, or there was progress on Egypt's human rights and democracy file, which obviously is not true. And so what happened afterwards, and maybe it's linked, maybe it's not, but I think there's a thin link tying them, is that this was interpreted as a green light. You're emboldening the incumbent. You're emboldening what's happening by basically whitewashing it. I don't know what's the accurate word for that situation exactly, but you are cheering on it. And when you did that, or when you do that, you embolden the other party. And when the other party is emboldened, they basically wreak havoc. And this is precisely what happened right after this assessment. You witnessed a surge in repression, and I think it culminated in a figure like Hisham Asim choosing to go into self-imposed exile, especially that he was planning to lead a parliamentary opposition bloc and even run for presidential election. So there was a lot of potential there. And he was widely respected in opposition circles and perhaps maybe elsewhere, but there's not a lot of circles left. So I think that was really the last nail, basically, in the coffin of Egyptian opposition, because it was already weak. I mean, even when he was here, opposition was extremely weak and insignificant. But with his presence, I think there was some level of, at least some potential. And now that potential is gone.
I do think he had potential, but honestly, I don't think there was that much potential given that he needed to. The problem is that you have three strands of Egyptian opposition, right? There's the Islamists, and not many people take them seriously anymore, but they have the most money because they have funding from abroad. Then there's the liberals, and then there's the socialists, right? All three of these hate each other. It's very much like it's a crab bucket, right? Whichever crab gets taken by the state to be boiled today, the others are cheering them on, but they're also attacking each other actively. And I don't think Hisham Asim fit into any of those three buckets well enough because he had liberal views, but he also had socialist views at the same time. Like he was very left of center. And I don't think he was socialist enough for the socialists, and I think he was too socialist for the liberals. But I don't begrudge him leaving. I mean, I would be a hypocrite if I did because I left. I don't begrudge him thinking that there's no point anymore in trying to act as opposition, because one thing that the liberal opposition specifically wanted was help from abroad. The problem is that a lot of the help they got from abroad was just talk. Because fundamentally, I think the biggest reason the EU keeps giving Egypt loans and why the EU is running astroturfing campaigns for Sisi nowadays is because they need him. Because he's very useful to have. He's essentially like, what if Erdogan was less of a prick to deal with? And that he could keep refugees away. He could gather refugees from other countries. He can help stabilize Libya. He can help them get oil companies into Libya and extract more oil from it. He can help them get the resources they need. If they eventually build that interconnect with Italy, he'll be providing renewable energy so that they can stop burning coal in Poland, because that's getting expensive, especially in terms of environmental cost. He can help them with outsourcing a lot of things. The problem is that he is uncomfortable to deal with. He's not as uncomfortable as Erdogan. Like I said, he's less of a prick to deal with. But dealing with him means that you have to make it palatable to your voter base to deal with him. Like when you had the Dutch prime minister coming here saying that he supports Cairo getting new bike lanes. Like, cool, buddy. But he has to do that in order to justify cozying up to Sisi. Well, why is he cozying up to him? It really comes down to two things: Shell and immigrants. Helping Shell get access to Libya, keeping immigrants away from Europe. That's more or less what it boils down to. And in a way, Sisi is essentially Europe's own man. Like, he doesn't have independent power away from them, but what he does have is power with their help. There are a lot of people who try to frame Egypt as being part of Russia's bloc. I don't think Egypt has ever been part of any bloc in particular, and that's part of what makes Egypt so useful, and that it's sort of like an economic Switzerland in between all of these. It's trying to get table scraps from all of these blocs at the same time. So like, if you want to talk to Xi Jinping and you want someone to put in a good word, Sisi's your man. If you want someone to get Giorgia Meloni to the table, Sisi's your man. If you want someone who is inexplicably close to Macron, Sisi's your man. But the problem is, when you have all these surface level friends and you don't have any actual close friends, when shit hits the fan, no one stands up for you. You saw this with Bashar al-Assad, right? The problem with Bashar al-Assad and comparing him to Sisi is that Bashar was the leader of a failed state. Like, no one was going to go to bat for Syria because there's nothing there. There's nothing left. Whereas with Sisi, Egypt's like economic fundamentals are still very strong for what it is. Then the biggest evidence of this is how much the IMF keeps breaking the government's kneecaps every time they do anything. And also the fact that everyone wants to buy its assets. No one is clamoring to buy Syrian assets right now. No one's trying to buy assets in Myanmar. No one's trying to buy assets in Gaza except America because they want land. But everyone's trying to buy assets in Egypt. And the one thing, to circle back on the asset thing, the one thing I'll give them credit for is that they so far haven't sold land. And that, I think that's the next domino to fall. because the usufruct deals that they've been giving have been getting longer and longer and longer and more permissive. I think it's bordering on asset sale at that point.
Yeah, but they did sell land, notably to the Emiratis and to the Saudis.
No, that was still a usufruct deal. That's the one thing that's in their favor. The problem is those deals were probably illegal because the executive government doesn't legally have the right to do that. Which, by the way, I think that was on purpose. Because if I were doing this, these land usufruct deals, the easiest way to get out of these long-term deals is to say, oh, this was illegal to do in the first place. So that's a way to make sure that they continue investing in the land that they get on usufruct. The problem with the usufruct is that otherwise it's harder to break out of.
But the Ras Al Hikmah deal, that so far we don't know exactly what went down aside from the price that was public. Nothing has been public so far, but it is effectively selling. Even if on paper they don't technically own it, they in reality do own it. And
Yeah, that's what
that
I
was
mean.
the
Like,
deal.
it's a usufruct, but it has the aesthetics of a sale. Because what does it mean when it's a usufruct, but you don't own the buildings on top of the land? That's essentially a sale. Like you're just deciding who gets to be your long-term tenant.
And yeah, and I think maybe one thing else we could discuss before we wrap up is the Tiran and Sonafir Islands and talks of establishing a US base there, and how these talks were refuted basically by people arguing that it was never handed over to Saudi and there are still Egyptian troops there, which via satellite data, which could be verified, there's already Saudi Coast Guard there. They even built their small little port there, and you can see them. You can see everything there. So I think this is extremely, extremely troubling, and how even this whole blunder, really, and how it reached that point, I think is extremely problematic.
Like everyone should agree on the basic fact that Turan and Sonofir were not Egyptian in 1967. In the year 1967, they were Saudi land that was leased to Egypt for 50 years. That's why it started in 2017. That wasn't a coincidence. The disagreement comes into who actually owned it from 1967 to 2017, because Egypt had effective control. It had effective legal control. But who owned it? And you could also argue who owned it historically, because historically it's been Egyptian. That much isn't really disputed except by Saudi Arabia, and they dispute ownership over everything because they want to expand forever. But in terms of who owned it in 67 legally, it was Saudi Arabia who gave it to Egypt as a lease for 50 years. The sale of it was weird because Saudi Arabia acknowledged that Egypt had a claim to it in order to buy it back, because it's not normal for you to say, hey, you can borrow my pen, and then me to come back and say, hey, do you want to buy your pen back? And then you to say yes. That doesn't make much sense. And that's where the confusion comes in. The terms of the sale were actually very specific when it happened, but I think most of them have been forgotten by now. The terms were that Egypt would get a lump sum payment, which it's already received. It wasn't very big, but I mean, again, you're selling someone else's land back to them legally. But part of the terms were Egypt gets to keep its base on Drone and Sonofir. You don't have to use satellite data. That base is official. It's always been there. It gets to keep its base. Saudi Arabia agrees to build a bridge across them at its own expense at some point, and agrees to invest in South Sinai. Now, they haven't built the bridge. They keep saying it's coming, but at this point, I don't know if it's ever going to happen. And they did invest by building the King Salman University. I think it's a national university, one of those things. The one that isn't public, but it's public-private. And they have invested in some parts of South Sinai by building hotels. But other than that, the main two terms of the deal are Egypt gets its military base there and gets some money. The other term of the deal surrounds oil. Now that's more obfuscated because the term of the deal was just that if there is oil discovered there within the Saudi EEZ that they gain by having the islands back under their control fully, then Egypt would get a cut. Now, there hasn't been an oil discovery, but there might be oil there. There's oil around the area there. But that hasn't come to the fore yet. And I think if it does, that whole treaty will just be torn up because everyone wants the oil. The big question is, can Saudi Arabia build a U.S. base there? It can. Like the sovereignty lies with Saudi Arabia on paper. Can Egypt block it? I think that if they really wanted to, they could. Because not because they can claim the islands, but because there's already an Egyptian military presence there, as well as the Saudi military presence. But more importantly, because Saudi isn't entirely the US's puppet. Anyone who tries to claim that Saudi is fully independent of the US is a fool, because most of their money comes from American oil companies. The vast majority of their money is from American oil companies. Aramco is a skin suit worn by Chevron and ExxonMobil. But Saudi Arabia has a rebellious streak to it when it comes to American bases specifically, because that is toxic. That is a poison pill. And you see a lot, well, when we talk about states being vulnerable, Saudi Vision 2030 is a state screaming from the rooftops that it doesn't want its people to revolt. When a state goes as far as buying Ronaldo for like almost $1 billion just to keep the youth from revolting, you know something's wrong. Having a base on Saudi soil is toxic. But they also want to get closer to the US, and they specifically want to get closer to Trump. And you have to remember with Trump is an avatar of America's oligarchs. But more importantly, they don't care about foreign policy. Maybe aside from Israel, but they don't care generally about foreign policy. That's his domain. So he can do more or less whatever he wants. And he's a deal maker. You give him something, you scratch his back, he'll scratch yours, but maybe he'll scratch you less than you scratch him. He always has to come out on top in the deal. He doesn't believe in non-zero-sum deals. He always believes in a zero-sum deal where he gets to be on top. So Saudi has just agreed to pay several $1 trillion to the US in financing. And they've agreed to finance a bunch of wind farms. And they've agreed to buy a bunch of US stocks and bonds. And they've agreed to open a US base. Where is the least shitty place they could open a base? Toran Sanofir. That's also a place where Israel would want a US base to be. Will Egypt block this? I don't think they care. I genuinely don't think they care. Because if they cared about having a US base in the Red Sea, in Aqaba, if they cared about having a US base on their doorstep, they would have bombed Jordan by now. So the US already has a giant base. It's just pretending to be a country.
But I kind of disagree with the part about Saudi independence. I think, and Saudi dependence on the US is almost existential. Not just the US, the West in general. And I can justify that just arguing through one domain. And that domain is keeping their populace, their youth, their young populace in check and in line. And to do that, to prevent them from revolting, you need technology, and that's technology that the West sells them: surveillance technology, spyware, even Israeli companies. So I think in that lens, it is existential. Without these sorts of technology, without these bases, without all of that, they could collapse.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like when you list the dependencies that Saudi has on the West, they depend on Western intellectual property. They depend on Western experts for things because they don't have domestic experts, because their universities don't do much, their populace doesn't do much. You have to remember that Saudi, unlike the rest of the Gulf, their population is much bigger than the rest of the Gulf. They can't just pay everyone off. And when they tried to do that, they gave them like a piddly national income. And they don't have people who are technically skilled at any one thing because they don't have a real economy. Like if you say, oh, I want to become Saudi's best banker, cool, then you have to go abroad first. Because the banking environment in Saudi Arabia is, this is the bank that lends to Aramco, this is the other bank that lends to Aramco, that's about it. When it comes to their pivot sort of in Vision 2030, most of what they want to do revolves around technology, and you can't have technology without being close to the West. You've seen this with Russia. You've seen this with China. You can have domestic technology without the West. You can't export technology without the West. They are the arbiters of technological intellectual property. They're the arbiters of copyright, and they're the arbiters of who gets to have certain technologies. But more importantly than all of this, is, like you said, the repressive aspect of it, that they can't keep this up without the West. And they wouldn't have the money for it without the West, because Aramco's income, like I said, it's a skin suit. It's not a real Saudi company. The chairman of the company is Saudi, but the actual people who run the company day to day are American. The companies that actually do the extraction, the logistics, The companies that handle all of the engineering side of it, they're all American. They're all American contractors. Even if they have like Egyptian contractors employed by the American companies, the companies are American. It's Chevron, it's ExxonMobil, it's Halliburton. They're the ones who run Aramco. So if the US woke up tomorrow and said Saudi Arabia shouldn't exist anymore, Saudi Arabia would crumble. But the level, they do still have a level of not independence in an existential form, but more they like to assert independence. And I think the US likes to humor them on that because when they assert independence, they pay for it later. And they usually pay in USD. And that's the one helpful thing, and that you can use Saudi Arabia as sort of a piggy bank. The money comes from the West, and the way to make money comes from the West, but they can hold the money for you, and they can disburse it for you later. And you can see this, for example, with Syria, right? The US doesn't give direct aid to Golani or Ahmed al-Shara or Atalitabi, whatever he wants to call himself tomorrow. But they do give it to him through Saudi Arabia. They give it to him through Qatar. They give it to him through the UAE. Which, do you think any of those would be on his side if they didn't have backing from Washington? Do you think that they would rebel against Washington when it comes to something as important as Syria? I don't think so. So they can act as an avatar. The basis thing, though, that's a big shift. Like, that's Saudi Arabia basically like bending over for America more than it has before, like more than ever before. So putting it on islands, not on the mainland, that's the least crappy way they can do it.
And I think before we wrap up, we need to speak briefly on Gaza. So I think we could start by your take, or which angle exactly you wanted to tackle.
So since we're focused on Egypt, I think from the Egyptian perspective, all of this stuff with Gaza is very unwelcome, especially with what happened to the Red Sea, what happened to Red Sea trade, the Suez Canal, etc. To give you an idea, last I looked at the data, Egypt made more money from flights having to be rerouted over it because they couldn't fly over Israel or Syria or Libya anymore than it made from the Suez Canal in the past year. That's insane. Like I think it was around 5 billion that they made from the canal, maybe even less than that, after they had made like 9, almost 10 billion before. That's huge for a country that's living paycheck to paycheck. So from that aspect, it's been horrible. But even worse is that like Israel keeps not so subtly talking about taking Sinai next, and it seems imminent they're going to take over Gaza. Even if they don't take it over, Sinai might be a target to take next, might be a target to form an incursion into next. I don't think Israel is stupid enough to actually go into a one-on-one war with Egypt, which is why I don't think it would be one-on-one. And I think part of it would be Egypt allowing Israeli companies in, allowing Israeli settlers in. Though so far, Egypt hasn't taken the bait. They've had bait thrown their way before, especially with the plan that came under Biden, where they would move Palestinians into Egypt. That was a poison pill from the very beginning. And I don't think that it pains me to say this, but I don't think Sisi gets enough credit for how he's managed the whole Israel and Gaza thing so far. Because if this was Mubarak, he would have given them Sinai by just to get the headache out of the way. I just don't see that there's a winning strategy. So far, he's been playing not to lose. And so far, he hasn't lost as much as he could have. But I don't think there's a way to win here. I don't think there's a way to win with Israel in general, unless the West gets sick of them, which maybe. I mean, this is the closest we've come in my lifetime to the West getting sick of Israel, but still, we're nowhere near that yet.
All right. Any closing remarks?
Main closing remark is I've been very negative throughout this, but I might be surprised. Like, I think that there might be something surprising coming, but who knows? It always looks worst when something is about to happen. I just don't know if that will happen when it comes to Gaza. And I don't know if that will happen in terms of Egypt, in terms of any political upheaval. I am going to be watching the 2025 election, but I don't think it's going to be very surprising. I think what would be most surprising is if the National Front don't run, and if the Nation's Future Party just stops existing. But I don't think that'll happen. Just like how I said before with the presidential election, that the most interesting thing they could do is have Sisi not run and keep that extra term in his pocket. But I don't think they're in the mood for experimentation. I think they're in the mood for something stable, something straightforward, something that doesn't excite anyone very much.
I agree, but I also think the upcoming parliamentary elections is not going to be as important. I don't think it's going to carry much weight. I think what ultimately is going to happen is that you're going to have pro-state parties compete basically for seats, and ultimately, I don't think this will positively impact the everyday lives of Egyptians in terms of, I mean, it's not real representation ultimately. So I don't think any of this actually matters at the end of the day. Um,
Well, it
and
matters in terms of the opposition can get some concessions out. Independent MPs can get some concessions for their local areas. Like if you've ever talked to someone from parts of the South where they have like an independent or lefty or liberal MP who actually gets something for them, that can change people's lives. But I think the big question will be, will people care? Because parliamentary elections in Egypt for ever since Nasser died, they've had really low turnout. The last election I think was 28%. But the last presidential election had pretty high turnout by Egyptian standards. Will that filter through to parliament? I don't think so. But if it does, it might be surprising even for the state.
yeah, and maybe one more thing on Gaza. I think what's unfolding right now as we record this and as you listen to it is unprecedented, really. I think what's happening is inexcusable.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen. I don't think we've ever seen, at least not in my lifetime, a genocide broadcast live where everyone knows it's a genocide, where the genociders call it genocide, and no one seems to care, and there don't seem to be any meaningful repercussions, especially when it's very clear that it's the hegemon's pet.
Yeah, and I think this will also have repercussions all over and on everything really, on democracy, on a lot of things, and I think it will continue to echo for generations to come. And I think it also hurt the West's image, especially that of the US, in terms
Yeah,
of this is
I
like
think.
unforgivable almost. Not
Yeah,
almost. I mean, it is unforgivable.
it is, and I think it's sort of the political and diplomatic version of the 2008 financial crisis. Like a lot of people who grew up with the 2008 crisis cannot trust capitalism anymore, and I'm one of them because we've seen it break. We've seen it not recover. We've seen the K-shaped recovery where the rich recover instantly, but the poor never do. And this is the same, but for diplomacy. Like you've seen the Western liberal order say, yes, we believe in everyone's right to self-determination except Palestinians. We believe in everyone's right not to be killed except Palestinians. We believe in everyone's right to international law except Palestinians. Like it's brazen is the part that I think will leave a huge mark for years to come.
And maybe something we could end on. I think we are also guilty as Egypt. I think there's guilt. There's a lot of things that should have been done that have not been done. There's pressure that should have been exerted. There are efforts, even basic. I think we should have taken at least all the injured and their families. We should have taken all the orphaned. Um, there were many a step that we should have at least offered to do that we should have done very long ago. And I don't know. I think it should really fill one with shame.
Oh, I completely agree. I think Egyptians have the right to be proud of the aid caravans that they sent in for all the good that does, given that Israel usually just doesn't let them through. But the most important part of Camp David to me, like the part that was most pernicious, is the fact that it tied Egypt and Israel at the hip. It's a symbiotic relationship. No one wants it to be, but it is. And we also have to be honest that Egyptians are racist towards Palestinians, like genuinely. Like there are actual laws that say that if you're Palestinian, you can't get citizenship, or if you're Palestinian, you can't become a permanent resident, or you can't get this visa if you're Palestinian, or you can't get that visa if you're Palestinian. Like we treat them as 10th class citizens. The fact that we treat them worse than we treat people from Sudan tells you everything because we don't treat Sudanese people very well either.
Yeah, but I think this is maybe on a state level, but I think on an individual level, I think an average Egyptian doesn't really think twice if he hears someone's Palestinian. It's like you don't really, it transcends identity. You're both Arab. You're both, you both look identical. Or at least that's my experience. I just think, I don't think very much differently.
I think there's sympathy. Like, there's more sympathy for Palestinians than for Sudanese.
Also for everyone too, not just Palestinians, Sudanese, Syrians, Yemenis, everything.
Yeah, I do think you have to separate how the people feel from how the state feels. But I do think that, like, if you were hiring, you wouldn't hire the Palestinian above an Egyptian. And I think that's part of the problem as well. But either way, like, the Palestinian won't be able to get to you to send you a CV in the first place if they're alive.
All right. Anything before we wrap up?
No, this was fun though.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure. And to fellow listeners, if you've made it this far, you're a true listener of the podcast. So please make sure you leave a rating and follow the podcast on all social media, and also drop us a message, circulate, get in touch, especially if you're in Cairo, and see you next episode.
هدي شوية يا حسن هدي شوية لدم الدوم مملكة الفرعون وأنا أبيت أن أكون مربوط بخيوط جوه مسرح العرايس كل يوم مضروب بدراع حب بايظ لكل شيء حدود هدي لدم الدوم مملكة الفرعون وأنا أبيت أن أكون مربوط بخيوط جوه مسرح العرايس كل يوم مضروب بدراع حب بايظ لكل شيء حدود وكل خطوة ليك محدودة رصيد بنفس مدفوق بقى الدنيا بتلف بتتغير وانت لسه مربوط يا سنة 2012 القرن الواحد والعشرين لو كنت لسه فاكرني عبد اقف عندك انا معنى كلمة نسيته من سنين انا بس تهت جوه نظام متحرف عشان يلاقي من الزعيم وانت يا مجلس عسكري كنت من الحاضرين وفقت لما كان مفروض تعارض ركبت لما كان مفروض تناضل سكت صوت الحق فيك الظالم هو الظاهر فلا تنطوي للعنانة لا لحكم العسكر الحكم في الميدان فلا تنطوي للعنانة لا لحكم العسكر الحكم في الميدان حرية التعبير خيال واقعي شايفينه الإعلام الرسمي مالكينه الخاص متقرب بس سامحينه فإعلامي عقلي بيموله دم أخويا اللي وقع جنبي في الميدان نقف كده الجدع جدع والجبان جبان واحنا يا جدع رايحين على الميدان الجدع جدع والجبان جبان واحنا يا جدع راجعين على الميدان الجدع جدع والجبان جبان واحنا يا جدع هنفضل في الميدان الجدع جدع والجبان جبان واحنا يا جدع رايحين على الميدان الجدع جدع والجبان جبان واحنا يا جدع راجعين على الميدان الجدع جدع والجبان جبان واحنا يا جدع هنفضل في الميدان الجدع جدع والجبان جبان واحنا يا جدع يهديكوا هذا الحفل برعاية وزارة الداخلية المصرية. طبعا زي ما احنا عارفين الداخلية بعد 25 غير طبعا الداخلية قبل